Okay, I think we'll get going. Welcome everyone to History Acts. I'm Stephen Blaney, I'm chairing tonight from Sheffield. So this is now our fourth sort of virtual workshop connecting historians with activists who are responding to the coronavirus crisis. And tonight our subject is prisons in lockdown, and we've got a really great panel to talk about that. So for people who aren't familiar with History Acts, what we try and do is connect activists and historians with a focus on making history useful for organising in the present. The format is we're going to have a panel of activists and historians. The activists are going to speak first for about 10 to 15 minutes each. Then the historians are going to respond, and then finally we'll open it up to group discussion so everyone can contribute. I'll explain how that will work when we get there again, but basically, if you want to speak, please send a private message to me in the chat, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. And there's a drop-down menu to send a message just to me, Stefan. Yeah, and then I'll call on people to speak in the order that I get their names. I'd ask so that we can make it as smooth as possible for people not to use the chat function during the talks, but just use it to message me if they want to speak. Finally, before I introduce the panel, just to let people know that we're recording tonight, and we'll be putting it out on YouTube and as a podcast. We'll also be live tweeting, and if you want to join in, you can use the hashtag HistoryActs. Yeah, I think that's it. So our speakers tonight. So first of all, we're going to have Dave from the Prisoner Solidarity Network. Then we've got Stella from the Cambridgeshire Prisoner Detainee Solidarity Group. And then our historians are Katherine Roscoe, who is a historical criminologist at the University of Liverpool, and Ben Bethell, who is a historian of penal theory, policy and practice at the University of the Arts London. So to kick off, Dave.
Yeah, hi. So on behalf of PSN, thank you for this invitation. It's really nice to be able to be part of conversations like this. I'm just going to offer a kind of blanket apology up front that I took this on quite last minute, so I'm maybe not as prepared as I'd like to be. And I'd also like to give some credit and appreciation to the other members of PSN who did most of the preparation for this and passed me notes. I'm going to read primarily, and I'm going to give a bit of an overview of Prisoner Solidarity Network as an organisation and its history, and then I'm going to talk specifically about the organisational challenges we faced as a result of coronavirus. So there will be things that will go unsaid or maybe assumed, but if those have become issues, we can talk them through in the discussion. So the Prisoner Solidarity Network was formed just under 2 years ago as the London chapter of the Incarcerated Workers Organising Committee, IWOC. IWOC was formed in the United States as part of the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW. The Wobbly is probably well known to people who have any sort of sense of the history of labour organising, a revolutionary trade union from the early 20th century. So the Incarcerated Workers Organising Committee was set up in the States in 2014, and it helped organise the biggest prison strike in US history in 2016, which was September the 9th, the 45th anniversary of the Attica uprising. And this did lead to branches springing up outside the US, including the London branch, which formed a little while after that, and operated as IWOC London until earlier this year when we changed the name to Prisoner Solidarity Network. This name change was motivated by feedback from members and potential members inside who found Incarcerated Workers Organising Committee an off-putting name because it sounds too bureaucratic and institutional and weird. So while we are still part of the IWW, this name change, I think, also signals a slight shift in emphasis away from labour organising in the sort of slightly more narrow way that they imagined it within prisons and towards a more holistic approach. But that is partly a consequence of the different political dynamics of prison labour in the US and the UK. And this process made us give some careful consideration to what we conceive this project as being. So we are not a charity and we are not a support group. So we didn't call ourselves, for example, the Prisoner Support Network. We do not imagine ourselves to be giving help sort of one way from us to people in prison. We are a network comprised of people inside and outside of prison, through which practical solidarity can be instantiated. And I would like to note that during these conversations, I suggested the Prisoner Mutual Aid Network and was told that mutual aid was an obscure anarchist term that would be hopelessly alienating to ordinary people and would never catch on outside of activist circles. And now here we are. So This solidarity kind of takes the form of an evolving set of activities, including a buddy system for people inside and outside to write to each other, assistance in making complaints about the prison system, applying external pressure and sort of protests, and contacting media when people are facing difficulties inside, sourcing legal advice for people, assisting with parole hearings, including giving references for people and securing their parole stuff, and sorting things out for people who have been released, helping people kind of land on their feet when they come out. We've just launched a new website, which is prisonersolidaritynetwork.uk, which has an intro pack which outlines our core principles, the activity of the organisation, and it also has an extensive list of resources for abolitionist politics and transformative justice, which I suspect people who have tuned into this call might already have some level of familiarity with, but also might be useful nonetheless. I'm actually going to move on and talk quite concretely about some of the issues we've had with the practicalities of organising during coronavirus. Particularly what I want to focus on is how we communicate with members inside. But I think maybe this issue of how to articulate our aims in accessible ways is maybe a good thing to come back to when we have the responses and the discussion, maybe some conversation about how to present abolitionist politics to wider audiences is worth having, and is definitely a challenge that we encounter on a regular basis. So on this issue of communication, we take our membership structure seriously. So prisoners are not the recipients of a service offered by people outside. They are full and active members of the PSN, but they are not able to participate in our online organising, just like they were not able to attend our in-person meetings before the lockdown. The online organising that we've been forced to do, everything that we're now on Slack and Zoom calls, has risks of being kind of exclusionary. One of our members was recently released after a 40-year sentence. And I mean, if you can imagine spending 40 years in prison and then getting out, and then the entire world is in lockdown and you're not allowed to leave your house still, and people aren't allowed to visit you to drop things off. Well, we did get this guy a smartphone, and he has had to teach himself how to use it in isolation in order to keep in touch with us. And he still hasn't. Trying to negotiate with him over the phone how to make Zoom calls, but this is a steep learning curve for people who don't have this kind of experience. So there is the first instance of these weird circumstances presenting us with kind of quite concrete problems. And broadly, we are forced to communicate with our inside members through the post, which is slow and unreliable and is subject to scrutiny by prison officers. And in fact, I heard today that one of our members has been threatened with having all contact with the PSN blocked off as a result of the content of his letters, which now we have to go and explain that his letters don't break the rules, and just another hurdle to get through just to be able to communicate with people. And these problems with post have always been the case, but coronavirus has made letters even slower and has created conditions on the outside which require even more swift responses. So that practical difficulty of really meaningfully incorporating people in prison in our organising structures is exacerbated. And communication remains this huge issue for us. With prisons on lockdown and all in-person visits suspended, getting in touch with people is just really, really tough. And the attempt to socially distance those inside prison has effectively created conditions of mass solitary confinement, which makes communication between prisoners harder as well. People are being let out of their cells for maybe only a few hours a day at the most, and we've had reports of people who are given only 15 minutes to shower and make a phone call. Call time is really limited in every estate. In some estates, it's only kind of 5 to 10 minutes. So you've also got every person on the wing queuing up behind you to use the phone in the same sort of hour slot or whatever, and incidentally, handsets are not being sanitized between use. So people have just enough time to get in touch with their loved ones and pass on some very brief details before they have to end the call. And then it might be some days or weeks before they're able to call again. And this also is having the effect that people in prison are not necessarily able to form an accurate impression of what's happening outside. I mean, we've got this absolutely kind of apocalyptic situation, and it's, if your only contact to that is some limited access to news on television and very, very brief phone calls with your family, it's really hard to know what's going on or who's being affected, all of that. But again, this is exacerbating and generalizing a set of conditions which were already present for many prisoners. So, for example, our member, Kevin Thakura, has been in conditions approaching solitary confinement for 10 years. He was convicted under a joint enterprise conviction, and he remains locked up in a close supervision centre, which is like a prison within a prison. I mention this because one of our last in-person activities before the coronavirus lockdown was a protest for him outside the offices of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, because the college accredits close supervision centres as what they term enabling environments, which kind of provides legitimacy to them, and the awful conditions which are perpetuated inside them. Obviously, there are no in-person protests at the moment. And similarly, I mentioned people having less access to showers as well. So hygiene problems in prisons have always been an issue. COVID has made them worse. Less access to showers, less access to sanitation products. But also, like, the sanitation problems in prisons were always a thing. At HMP Coldingley, there was a lack of in-cell sanitation, which was kind of already being reported on. There were reports that prisoners were having to use plastic bags as toilets. You know, the details are really shocking. And this was reported on Radio 4 quite recently, in the last couple of months, with the result that every cell in the prison was spun by guards who were looking for the cell phones that the prisoners were using to communicate with the family and journalists on the outside who were broadcasting the story. So you've got this other issue of people's inability to communicate. And when this awful expose happens, the prison's #1 priority is making sure that information doesn't get out again. And incidentally, the guards were going from cell to cell without PPE. So this kind of gesture of social distancing, of keeping all these prisoners in isolation, is constantly undermined by the security activities of the guards. So I'm going to shift slightly and talking about something that we've done beyond addressing our own organisational things, which is this fundraiser we've been running. So the aim of this fundraiser, which is just simply taking donations and transferring money to people's canteen accounts, with the aim that they can at least then have the means to make phone calls and to purchase kind of hygiene products and to purchase extra food, because access to all of those things is severely reduced. People are not able to send things in or to take things in visits. So one way of making sure that people are not completely isolated in prison is by giving them money to make phone calls, because the private company that runs prison phone calls is incredibly expensive, and so on. We have raised and distributed just over £13,000 so far, which is quite a lot, maybe more than we expected. This itself has come through with problems. The MOJ has a reasonably good online system for transferring money to prisoners, except if you try and transfer money to multiple prisoners, it decides you're up to no good and stops you. So we've had to invent structures where money is distributed to a range of activists who then each make 4 transfers each. It's just a lot of logistical hassle. In Scotland, if anyone can correct me on this, I'd love to hear it. Until very recently, the last month, there was no way of transferring money to prisoners other than by posting them cash. We don't have a lot of experience with Scottish prisons, but when we started getting requests for money there, we had to go and link this up, and there was no way of getting money to people there. They have now belatedly corrected that. And we also have this issue with private prisons, because private prisons can set their own terms for what they allow people to bring in. So we have been transferring people money and had responses back from prisons where they simply say, no, that money can't go through. We refuse to give it to the person. And we're now in these difficult situations, having to give money to prisoners' families to transfer, which then takes away a lot of their agency and control over the situation, and leads to problems and so on. And another issue we've had with this is that although we have raised quite a lot of money, demand massively outweighs donations. We've had to now lock off applications from people requesting those funds, although we are still very much soliciting donations if anyone is feeling moved to do that. And one of the issues that has come up, just to kind of bring back to something I said earlier, through this fundraiser is the question of how we articulate our politics and who we're trying to appeal to. So at a time when we want people to give us money, we need to present a certain version of our politics, which is perhaps less antagonistically abolitionist than we would normally like. And this is a real cause for concern. That this causes a lot of consternation when we have to make these discursive compromises. We also have this issue that although I think abolitionism should be a natural position for people on the left, it's not necessarily, or it is only in sort of lip service, and a lot of the left doesn't take it as seriously as I would like them to. We have this other issue that many of the groups who are also active around prisons are far more reformist in nature, or are centered around innocence. There are a lot of campaigns, people who are trying to do work to improve the conditions of people living in prison are doing so on the presumption that, or on the insistence that the people they care about are innocent and have been wrongly convicted. Well, as abolitionists, this is not the standpoint we take. We are fully committed to supporting guilty people. That's not the way we stake our politics. And perhaps the most difficult thing of this is that even amongst prisoners, and especially their families, there's not as widespread abolitionism as you might hope. So the very people that we are trying to make connections with in order to kind of grow this network of solidarity are at points suspicious of our politics sometimes because of a range of ideological reasons. And this kind of came to a head with the hashtag you might have seen that was going around, which was being spread far more prominently in America, but made it to UK organisations as well, which was Free Them All for Public Health, which became a bit of an issue. The people who were who we wanted not only to donate money but also to apply to take money from us decided some of them, I'm not, don't want to generalise, people complained that they didn't think everyone should be freed for public health, that some people deserve to be in prison. So I've kind of decided to bring us back to this question of how we communicate these abolitionist politics, how we frame them, because I think all of the things I mentioned before, the logistics and the communication stuff, that is the difficulty of political organising. That's kind of what you have to work through. But I guess the ideological impediments are a different kind of problem, and one that I'm quite keen to work through, I guess. So I'm going to end it there. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Dave. I'm going to drop in the chat now the link to the intro pack that was mentioned, and also to the GoFundMe. So if people could donate, that would be great. Next up, we've got Stella from the Cambridgeshire Prisoner Solidarity. I haven't got it in front of me. Cambridgeshire Prisoner Solidarity something. Stella.
Cambridgeshire Prisoner and Detainee Solidarity. Nice try. It's a bit of a mouthful. I feel like I'm kind of coming from a very fresh, kind of different, like a young organisation, in that we formed in response to the coronavirus crisis. So we've only been around since sort of April. So not quite the 2 years of experience. And I just definitely do want to give shout out to Prisoner Solidarity Network, because some people from their campaign came over and helped us and have been in conversation. So it's been really great to get that advice amongst abolitionist activist groups. So that's been really great. But yeah, so we are one of those groups that was set up in response to a comment thread in a mutual aid group. Who would have thought it? This time, 3 months ago, I'd have said absolutely not. But so we, there was a comment thread in Cambridgeshire mutual aid group about prisoner solidarity and how we can show support for detainees and prisoners in the Cambridgeshire area. But this is something that most of the people that responded to that thread had been involved in for a while, at least on a kind of theoretical or political level, that people have been going to protests around these issues. But it's also something that we noticed there wasn't in Cambridge or in Cambridgeshire. There kind of isn't a Cambridgeshire focused prisoner detainee solidarity group until now. So we put that together. We've had quite a few meetings. We've been meeting every week at the moment to kind of set things up. But the way we decided to do it was to focus on a different prison or detention centre in Cambridgeshire each week. And then we'd give people 3 actions sort of staggered across the week to take part in. And this is absolutely inspired by CAPE, so the Campaign Against Prison Expansion's week of online action. And this is kind of how we were thinking about getting around this weird issue of how we can build up communities, especially when this is such a new group online, and how we can get that kind of group feeling and get people involved while we can't actually meet in person, and we can't have these kind of open meetings or bump into people or arrange those socials that at least is how I've been organising in the past before now. But it's definitely been a learning curve for us all. So yeah, we've been doing actions from kind of email templates, getting people to mass tweet, recommending banner drops. I did a little banner drop tutorial, which was really fun. And we've been doing like coordinated posters across Cambridgeshire. So those are the kind of practical things that we've been doing. And it's partly to do some raising of awareness amongst our communities, because from that thread in the mutual aid group, we could tell that so many people just had no idea, even that there were prisons in Cambridgeshire. You know, it's the kind of level of thought that people had given to this was so it was so detached from what a lot of us who'd been involved in these sorts of organising for a while had experienced. So in our first week, we focused on Yarlswood Detention Centre. So Yarlswood is just outside Cambridgeshire, actually, but quite a few of us in the group had been on Yarlswood protests in kind of previous years, and had during their time, sometimes at the university, quite a few of us, our ex-students, had been on the rallies at Yarlswood. So it seemed like a good place to start with our campaign. And also a woman in Yarlswood was the first confirmed positive coronavirus case, we think, in a UK detention centre, although it's very difficult, obviously, to know these things. But that was in early March, and despite that, new detainees were being sent to Yarlswood for the rest of March. So it's like a particularly concerning situation in those places. So we did a banner drop that week, and we encouraged people to put posters up across Cambridgeshire, which was really lovely. And that was a really good way of getting people involved as well, because it was kind of people seeing things, seeing posters, seeing social media. The second week we were looking at HMP Peterborough, which is run by a private company, Sodexo, who are, you know, a crucible of many, many evils. There's been kind of multiple public scandals in recent years on Sodexo's abuse of prisoners, and actually in HMP Peterborough in the last couple of years there have been particular instances of really horrible cases of harassment and abuse of prisoners. So that was something we wanted to highlight. And it also brings me on to something that Dave was just talking about, that's been a kind of discussion for us, is that we don't want to limit our demands or our kind of imaginations around this to the current pandemic. And we think that would be doing a disservice to the people that are in prison, but also to abolitionist ideas, if we allowed the narrative to just be, we want these people in prison to be a bit safer during coronavirus. And I've seen a lot of discourse around kind of, we don't have the death penalty in Britain, so why are we allowing people to die in our prisons? But we had a discussion about this, and actually it's not that we're asking, we're not thinking that the only reason this is bad is because we don't have the death penalty. We know that people die in prisons all the time. The whole prison industrial complex is killing people, and it's set up to kill people. That's the way it functions. And it's not about whether or not they, you know, whether we portray this innocent prisoner who we want to have a luxurious prison experience. It just doesn't work out like that. So that was our kind of key a kind of key cornerstone of our discussions right from the start, and that links into the kind of choice of prisons that we've been focusing on, because this week it's quite a difficult one, because we've decided to focus on HMP Little Hay, which is a prison for men convicted of sexual violence, and this was done in the full acknowledgement that it's a really difficult topic, but it's a prison in Cambridgeshire, and it's where 2 of the first prisoners died from coronavirus in the UK. Again, it's difficult to tell, and there's actually some evidence that it was in HMP Peterborough that the first prisoner died, but it's not really about that. There are people dying in there now. People are in there at the moment in horrible conditions. And it's not, we decided that though we found this very difficult, and as a group of people, we all had very difficult kind of opinions on how we should approach this. But we decided that prison abolition for us isn't about denying that real harms have been done. It's about the belief that prison perpetuates rather than repairs that hurt. And we need to find ways to actually prevent the harm from taking place. So we decided to do a lot of research and share resources on transformative justice and community justice and those sorts of things, and have that kind of hand in hand with the actions that we're asking people to do around HMP Little Hay. And it's really important that we do pay attention to HMP Little Hay, because that's one of the prisons which is being chosen to trial the prefabricated prison cells thing that has been announced. So the government is trialling, I think it's 500 prefabricated cells are to be built across the country. And HMP Little Hay is one of those. And it's worth thinking about how that links to the kind of mass expansion of prison capacity that's been going on. It's not a new thing. I know there's that Prison Island report, which found that it's kind of the increase of prison estate in the UK has been exponential in the last like 50 years. And we know that increasing places in prisons is not a kind of respond to increased need of places in prisons. In fact, it's the other way around. They'll create more space and then find more people to put in them, which is obviously horrific considering we want to be abolishing prisons. So we have been this week looking at how we can oppose the building of these prefabricated cells. And this is directly as a response to coronavirus, right? It's saying that people should be imprisoned individually or in solitary confinement, and that is for their own safety. But we know, I mean, this is me drawing in history, we know that that's not the case. Like during the AIDS crisis peak, that this is exactly what they did then, tried to separate people in prison into solitary, wow, I'm really struggling. And that just stigmatizes or makes it more difficult for those people to access help, to access resources, to be able to use the phone, and leaves them more vulnerable to the kind of abuse that we've seen at these prisons. So like in HMP Peterborough by the private companies like Sodexo. So it's worth thinking about how this current crisis is not a new moment for the prison industrial complex. It's just that they're capitalizing off of it to expand even more rapidly the program which was already undertaken. So yeah, I feel like I'll round that up there. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Stella. I'm intrigued by the idea of solidarity confinement. So next, we'll move on to our historian side of the panel, and we're going to start with Katherine.
Brilliant. Thanks, everyone. It's great to be invited and be involved in these discussions as a historian. So I'm a historian of convicts. That's the historical term that I will be using. I understand there might be issues with that, and I'm very happy to talk about that in discussion. But when you're enmeshed in a lot of 19th century literature, it's hard to get yourself out sometimes of those ways of talking. So convicts who were transported across the British Empire at the time in the 19th century, so to Bermuda, Australia and Gibraltar. And while it might seem that this is a very different kind of punishment to what we're talking about, because it involves, being mobilized across vast geographical distances, of course, we see that kind of separation still from families and social networks in prisons. We know that in America in particularly, those distances can be extremely vast. And also there are these sort of serial displacements between being mobilized and then in one form or another of a prison or a prison ship or a hulk, which is a decommissioned prison ship. So there are sort of parallels to be drawn that are hopefully useful here. And so while listening to Dave and Stella, who were both really illuminating, it got me thinking about how some of this historical material might relate. And one of them is thinking about how abolitionists and anti-carceral activists might communicate in a socially distanced way. And in a way, the 19th century is quite helpful in this respect, because particularly when we're talking about the colonies, these were places that the people that they were talking to, so the activists themselves, were often never visited, or if they had, they were sort of tasked with communicating that back to Europe and making people care. And the way that this really worked was through vast networks of correspondence. But that meant that it was an incredibly middle class kind of set of activists. And these were activists that were not anti-carceral per se. They were about prison reform, usually along religious lines of some form or another. But what these networks did do well was to link different kinds of networks of influential people. So Quakers were a very strong sort of group of anti-transportationists, as well as abolitionists of slavery. So they would communicate with government officials. They had these that were high up, and then they would sort of meet at moments where they had overlapping interests. And the same with an organisation called the Aborigines Protection Society, also based in London. They would sort of be in communication with the colonial people on the ground, say missionaries, or maybe a few members of colonial government that also happened to be interested in that. They would write, they would do exposés, and then they would sort of funnel it back, particularly through the press, but sometimes in a House of Commons speech. And so it's useful to think about where I think intersections between networks might be helpful to give events maximum sort of impact to an audience that might not be generally disposed to think about how prisoners might be coping in general, but particularly in a pandemic and how they're treated. And the other thing that we see quite commonly is information on prisons. At the time, visiting was often stricter. So for example, one of the places that I look at, which is Rottnest, which is in Western Australia, which was a prison island for Aboriginal prisoners from 1839 to the 1930s, people couldn't visit. It was illegal to have your boat anywhere near. It was illegal to visit. The only person, ironically, that was allowed to visit was the governor, who holidayed on the island and had a nice hunting lodge there while it was a prison. And the prisoners were his collected snipe and stuff for him when he shot them. So shot the birds. He didn't shoot the prisoners, but I mean, still, the whole juxtaposition is really despicable. But anyway, so he knows what the conditions are of the prisoners. We have a mass outbreak of influenza that is long in the making. It affects 80 people die. Out of about 141 people catch it out of 147. So 141 out of 147 people end up falling ill. And he knows about this and he tries to cover it up. And it's only because we get anonymous reports, first by a prison staff member in the press, so similar to what Dave was saying to some extent. And then they try and close it down. They have another internal inquiry that obviously says basically that it's because Aboriginal people don't do well in confinement. It has nothing to do with lack of clothing provision, overcrowding in cells, no fireplaces, so everybody's cold, all sorts of things that are causing it. And instead, it takes more pressure externally, so including testimony from a released Aboriginal prisoner. And I can't stress enough that in the 19th century, they were not asking prisoners how they felt very often. And the fact that we see Indigenous testimony in this case really speaks to how effective I think it was as a mobilizing technique. And they were sort of building on existing quite paternalistic relationships with missionaries, but in this case, to bring attention to the conditions in the prison. And they were even, and then eventually there was a new governor. London exerted enough pressure to bring a new governor who sort of put pressure to get a new superintendent, and conditions improved. But what I would say, which speaks to what Stella was saying, was that the structural conditions were not changed, in the sense that there was sanitary reform, health conditions improved, but prisoners, basically the reason that this had broken out in the first place was because a magistrate had been overzealously sentencing Aboriginal people. So he was allowed to sentence prisoners to up to 2 years confinement for stealing sheep in areas that had recently been colonized. They didn't even know they were breaking British laws. And what ends up happening is he starts sentencing them to 3 years, and the government retroactively allows that. So if anything, the sanitary reforms kind of gives them cover to actually increase the carceral apparatus they're using at these fringes of empire. And, you know, I think that's the kind of most difficult part, in a sense, about drawing these connections from the past and the present, which is that these are not anti-carceral activists. They are people that want to treat prisoners better, and particularly Aboriginal prisoners better, as a kind of person in need of protection. And it actually leads to the creation of an Aborigines Protection Board, which is another whole muddled mess of basically welfare and surveillance, but with some blankets and some rations thrown in. And that's a direct result of what happens in the prison. So it's almost a desire to bring more people under care. Anyway, I hope I explained that in a way that makes sense. The other thing that I was thinking of was, in my research, I've slightly been tempted to think that the general public was less interested in the fate of prisoners abroad, because it was abroad. But listening to everybody speak, I wonder if actually that visibility, invisibility is just as much operation if it's right around the corner, if it's in Cambridgeshire. People aren't aware, and people need to be made aware. And so in some ways, it doesn't really matter if they're 100 kilometers away from a general public perception. Anyway, and that what pandemics bring to light, for example, outbreaks of cholera in Gibraltar, or outbreaks of yellow fever in Bermuda, which disproportionately affected prisoners who were on prison hulks, which were damp and overcrowded, so perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes and all kinds of disease, was that there was only a fear, basically, that it would be locked down and not affect the colonists. And then the second issue was, oh, is this an external cause or an internal cause, i.e. do we need to close down shipping? Which again makes me think about these kinds of who's enclosed and who isn't. And it's a very, basically a rare person that notices that it's stepped up the social, down the social ladder, basically. So if it's affecting free people. And there's one single newspaper report that I found about Gibraltar where they say, actually, cholera has affected people down the social ladder. It's affected convicts, 40 have died, and how difficult it must be for them to not have social communities to lean on. And the only other time that they're recognised is when they volunteer as nurses, which they did, which many of them did, to help keep their compatriots alive, and they were dying rapidly. But again, that's kind of framed in this paternalistic way where they get a reduced sentence, and it's all kind of put down to a sort of hero narrative, which we're very familiar with, and how that again enables a sort of disposable population without actually addressing some of the root causes. You know, they're not talked to afterwards about why it might have caused it. They just say, oh look, here's a letter that the prisoner wrote, and he's so happy to be able to help ease the suffering of some of his, you know, fellow inmates. And I suppose one of the final things I wanted to talk about was, in this sense, thinking about detention centres in particular, the kinds of post-colonial legacies that we can see. So to think about solidarity of people in prison and their communities out of prison. So one particularly noticeable example was in Bermuda with the yellow fever outbreaks that I talked about in the mid-19th century. The prisoners were most affected, but then second to them was the free people of colour, the Bermudians, who'd been working on the dockyard. They'd previously been working alongside white people on the dockyard, but then there was, after one outbreak of yellow fever, a kind of sanitary reform of their houses. So the white workers got toilets and, water closets, and houses, and then the black workers were made to leave. And then in the next set, 10 years later, there's another outbreak. They are dying at almost the rate of convicts. So I think that just struck me among current discussions of the coronavirus and what we're seeing here, as there are these very strongly raced implications that I think we can never lose sight of, and play out in a carceral and every context, I suppose. And I think the final thing, and then I'll stop going on, is it really chimed with me what Dave said about exacerbating and generalizing conditions that were already there, and that the pandemic is not a state of emergency. And though it's rarely recognized by the governments who are investigating these outbreaks, it's very obvious to looking back that all of these conditions are existent, that these are things that have been going on for ages, and that in fact a state of emergency is often what allows the government to elide their responsibility and to just put in a temporary fix. And I think that might actually be the most useful part of history in terms of thinking about applications, which is to take this long view. There's a lot of data associated, and I think we can show that these are not new issues, and hopefully that might be a persuasive tool for the public. Ideally it would be for policymakers too, but I don't hold out that much hope, but that's what I hope history could bring to people who are looking to make change, like a lot of you here today. So thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Katherine. So our final speaker from the panel is returning History Acts guest, Ben Bethell. I will say before Ben starts, after this we're going to open it up to group discussion. So if you do want to reserve a spot in the discussion to speak, do send me a private message using the chat. And if you just send me your name, then I can call people to speak in that order. So Ben, take it away.
Thank you, Stefan. I'm Ben Bethell. I should, in case it's not a huge deal in the scheme of things, but just in case anyone's puzzled, I've got sort of two professional hats. So I recently finished in January. I finished a PhD at Birkbeck, which was about aspects of penal administration in England at the end of last decades of the 19th century and the sort of early decades of the 20th century. Basically, I was kind of looking at sort of what happened after the system of transportation that Katherine's studying, when that came to an end in the middle of the 19th century, the sort of high security prisons that were built in England to accommodate the prisoners that hitherto would have been transported to Australia. But I'm not actually a historian of prisons at University Arts London. I've got my day job is I'm an hourly paid lecturer at Central St Martin's, which is an art school, and I just sort of teach cultural studies and cultural history. Well, I'm probably going to be unemployed as of next term, like so many of you. Stefan's nodding; he knows all about it. Like so many hourly paid university teaching staff as of next term. So yeah, I'm not sort of doing the two things. My interest in prison isn't related to my employment at University Arts. And as we were sort of, Katherine and I were saying, just before this started, it's fantastic to be invited to do this, but you always sort of really wonder, really sort of how much use, whatever knowledge or whatever perspective I'm able to bring to the wider topic of a historian, how much use that actually is to people who are kind of doing the kind of work that Dave and Stella are doing. So I'll just sort of talk, briefly. There's a broad historical context that's kind of interesting about the history of prisons and the history of epidemiology and public health and disease management. That is broadly maybe interesting. And then just a couple of thoughts that I've had just basically about the way the government's response to addressing the danger of what they've described as an explosion, potentially an explosion of coronavirus in English prisons, and how that's differed to other countries such as France and Italy. What I'm saying is they haven't done the mass release. So in other countries there has been mass release, and that was something that was promised to an extent in this country, and they've kind of reneged on that promise. So I think it's just kind of interesting to maybe look at sort of what's going on there and why that's happening. So just to begin with the kind of history stuff, as I say, there's this sort of disease management and prison history are kind of inextricably linked, because, you know, what we think of in the sort of classic Michel Foucault sense as the modern prison. So, you know, this kind of big transformation happens to carceral environments at the very beginning, very end of the 18th century and into the 19th century in Europe and North America. And, you know, prior to that, for instance, you know, Newgate Prison in London, the classic Georgian prison, you know, to the layman, you could maybe think about, you know, when we see on TV, you know, like huge prisons in Brazil or Peru or somewhere like that. It's just kind of very, very chaotic, sort of Hobbesian environment. But in a way, sort of within that, there's actually, at least for the sort of tougher or better connected prisoners, there's actually sort of a great deal more liberty afforded to some prisoners than there would be in prisons in the United States or in the UK or other European countries. And there's much more connection with the outside world. So it's a much less of a controlled environment, is what I'm trying to say. And then that changes, you know, really beginning in this country, that Belgium and the United States and France are the sort of countries that really lead the way, moving into what we think of as the modern prison, as this very, very controlled, austere, regulated environment. And a big part of that is a certain style of architecture. And cellular, the division Stella spoke about, solitary confinement. So the idea that each prisoner is effectively in solitary confinement in a solitary cell. And as we know, you know, the Victorian prisons that are still kind of scandalously, you know, part of the prison infrastructure in this country, you know, were designed, those cells were designed for a single prisoner, but due to overcrowding, you know, they've ended up sometimes with, you know, three prisoners, three individuals occupying a cell that's designed for a single prisoner. My point is that the introduction of that type of architecture was actually as a response to disease management. So John Howard, who's kind of like the pioneer, he wrote a book called The State of the Prisons, I think published in 1777. He was a magistrate, and he went around the country, rode around the country, kind of doing a survey of the state of what were any sort of, you know, filthy, decrepit, chaotic, and very, very heterogeneous institutions. Of various kinds around the country, jails and houses of correction and all the rest of it. But what prompted him to do that as much as anything was what they called jail fever. Jail fever was epidemic typhus, and it was associated with prisons. It was also associated with military camps. So something would you know, if there were big military campaigns, they'd be accompanied often by epidemic typhus. And they weren't too worried about the prisoners, but you know, for instance, in Newgate, the last big outbreak was 1750, but it had killed judges and it had killed witnesses and lawyers, and you know, there'd be epidemics of typhus that were understood to have originated in these kind of like filthy prison conditions. So the idea of you know, building these new institutions and separating everyone in separate cells was primarily, or at least an equal objective, was disease management and disease control, and to create these sanitary environments where disease wouldn't spread. And then, of course, that had the added advantages in terms of prison discipline. So the idea was that then, you know, the prisoners wouldn't be able to communicate with each other either. So they wouldn't be able to sort of spread bad influence between each other. So there's ideas of contagion, there's disease contagion, and there's also what they thought of as moral contagion. So, you know, one prisoner is sort of, you know, perhaps not as bad or evil or wicked as another prisoner, but the wicked one influences the others and they all become bad. So they're all released originally from prison. We still have this idea, it's still common in the popular media that, you know, people go to prison and that prisons breed villains. This idea. So the idea of the separate cells in the architecture of the regulated prison is to control the prisoners and control their behaviour, but also to make them sanitary and to control the spread of disease. And so, you know, one of the things I'm interested in is that I'll call it reform, whether it's, you know, it's accurate to think of it as reform. It's a change. But you know, the term prison reform was used at the time. So as a historian, I'd use that term. So one of the ideas I'm interested in is that prison reform actually anticipates sanitary reform, and that the sanitary reform and the building, for instance, of the sewers and the sanitary reform movement of Edwin Chadwick that really sort of kicks off when cholera arrives in this country. It's a new disease that arrives here in 1831 that kicks off the sanitary reform movement. That, you know, prison reform is really the precursor of sanitary reform, and that you can think of the Victorian prison infrastructure in much the same way as you can think of the sewers that were built in response to cholera by Bazalgette in London, for instance. So as I say, the two are kind of very, very intimately tied. The result being that the model prisons, the reform prisons that are built, the penitentiaries that are built in the middle of the 19th century are actually uncommonly clean and sanitary environments compared to the city around them. So for instance, Pentonville, which, as I say, absolutely scandalously, you know, is still used at this moment to this day as a prison. And as I understand it, conditions in there are absolutely appalling. But when it's first built, it's built as a model prison. Each of these individual cells that the prisoners are supposed to spend their time in is equipped with a flushing toilet, a flushing water closet. And a flushing water closet is like an innovation at the time. You know, most people in London, most people in England, or many people in England, first get to use and experience and witness a flushing toilet 10 years later at the Great Exhibition. The public toilets at the Great Exhibition are flushing toilets, and this is, for many people, their first encounter with a flushing toilet. Well, 10 years prior to that, they've got toilets in every cell in Pentonville, and they actually took those toilets out 40 years later because prisoners would stuff them up or use them for, you know, in terms of a disciplinary issue. They end up taking the toilets out and then kind of reinstalling a version. Then whenever that was, whenever they finished with slopping out, which was only 20 years ago, or whenever that was. So yeah, I'm just trying to make this point that and as well. So when there are epidemic diseases in the cities, in the kind of quite poor working class areas, inevitably these prisons always built on the outskirts of town. In impoverished areas, that actually it's the prison that's the quarantine zone that is actually free from the epidemic, because it's such a controlled environment and people leaving it and entering it in such a controlled way that prisons sometimes escape epidemics that actually infect the urban environments that surround them. So that was just the kind of like broader relationship between prison reform and sanitary reform. And then the only other thing that I kind of found interesting in terms of, before I'm aware I've gone on too long, I'll try and stick to 5 more minutes, Stefan, just to cover the other stuff that I wanted to say. That the other thing that's always really interesting to me now is that really from the mid-1880s, the prison population of this country begins to decline, and it falls steadily. There's a slight increase in the Edwardian period. It goes up very slightly and then it drops again during the First World War, and it continues to drop right the way through the 1930s. It drops below 10,000 at one point, as we know it's sort of 85,000 at this point, and it's only after the Second World War in the late 1940s that it starts to climb again, and it's climbed consistently since the 1950s. And it's extraordinary to read not only prison administrators, but conservative Home Secretaries in the 1920s and 1930s saying, they're not abolitionists, but they are minimalists. They believe in getting rid of prisons, and they congratulate each other. We've closed more prisons, and there's another prison closed, and the numbers are decreasing all the time. So they are advocates of minimal incarceration, and I think I wanted to raise that in relation to, because I think that it's interesting that the promise to release when the coronavirus arrived. So we're going to release 4,000 prisoners. The Ministry of Justice promised at the beginning of March. As I understand it, I mean, this is a couple of weeks ago, but they in the end, they only released 33 prisoners, and that was included pregnant prisoners. And that can be, I don't have figures for the United States, it's not federal prisons, but from state prisons, they've released many thousands of prisoners in different states in the United States. In Italy, they released 6,000 prisoners in the space of 6 weeks. In France, they released 10,000 prisoners in the space of a month. I think there's a thing that policy of release really goes against the grain, which was, as Stellan was saying, is to build more prisons and to incarcerate more people. So it's just interesting quickly to think, why they've reneged on that promise to release. And as far as they're concerned, it's because they've succeeded in containing the explosion that they feared. So apparently they feared 3,000, at the beginning of March, it was feared that there were possible 3,500 deaths from coronavirus in English prisons. Currently, I think they're looking at about 20 deaths. And they're anticipating that, if they sort of continue on with the current policy for another year or so, that they'll be looking at about 100 deaths. And they regard that as an acceptable price to pay. And the only way that they've managed to achieve that, though, as we heard from Stella and Dave, is basically putting everyone on 23.5 hour a day lockdown, banning all visits, and really creating conditions that are intolerable. And the question as well is that, and mainstream reformers such as the Howard League and everyone else are asking, but are you actually intending to sustain this for another 12 months? That it's intolerable, the idea that you're going to continue with prisoners basically in permanent solitary confinement, locked in the cells 23.5 hours a day or more. You've heard there was a thing about Wandsworth Prison, apparently, that prison inspectors reported that of Wandsworth prisoners who were suspected of having the virus. So some have been locked up for 14 days without being able to use a shower, without any exercise at all, literally 14 straight days banged up in a cell. And they seem to be, the idea is, we're just going to try and keep this going for another year and then we'll get away with 100 deaths. And I think that the reason that they're doing that is because the coronavirus, as it does in lots of other ways, it represents a moment of opportunity. So one of the American prison reformers was talking about, Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, which is like, if there's a crisis, capitalists never let the crisis go to waste. They'll always try and make some money out of it. And they're going, really, we have the potential here for a reverse shock doctrine. So, for instance, if you take the example of street homeless, if you're able actually just to remove all the street homeless from the streets, why do we have to have street homelessness? And similarly, if you're able to release 10,000 prisoners, you know, overnight from English jails, why did they need to be there in the first place? So I think that, you know, in a sense, it does, and for abolitionists, or even just for, you know, perhaps minimalists, you know, it really does, as it does in other areas, it's a moment of opportunity, because it lets people see something clearly, you know, that has hitherto been concealed, and just been made to look inevitable and natural, which, you know, as we know, is always a sign that there's kind of sort of an ideological basis for something. Anyway, I've kind of rattled on for far too long, but I'll leave it there. Thanks for letting me do this, Stefan. Really appreciate it. Cheers.
Cheers, Ben. Yeah, so now we're going to open it up to sort of group discussion. I haven't got anyone waiting yet. The way this is going to work is, if you want to speak, just private message me in the chat box. There's a drop-down menu where you can find me, and if you just put your name, I'll call people to speak in the order that they come. I haven't got anyone so far, so I'll ask the first question, I guess. So, I mean, kind of building on what Ben said at the end there about the sort of increased visibility of this issue, perhaps, and the sort of opportunity that it might present, and Dave's point at the start about how we can sort of articulate an abolitionist politics in a way that might you know, be acceptable or palatable to people who haven't really thought about these issues before. And I was interested in that respect in the sort of Katherine's point about the sort of coalitions that were able to be built around sort of middle-class reformers and sort of religious missionaries, and how that might interact with the more radical politics. And also, I'd be really interested to hear more about the sort of the mutual aid thread that Stella was talking about, and how these discussions played out on there, and, you know, at what point you had to abandon that thread. So if anyone wants to jump in on that, that'd be great. And yeah, do put your name in the chat if you want to talk. To the panel, if anyone wants to jump in, just go ahead.
Will I discuss the good old mutual aid thread? I think it's interesting, right? Because it was someone posted on there who was a student at Cambridge University and was kind of had been involved in some student activism, and had heard that students used to go to Yarlswood to protest about the women in detention there, and so it was kind of initially a like, oh, could we do something around Yarlswood? But I think that's where there is a difference between detention centres and prisons, obviously, and there is a difference, I think, in people's perceptions of detention centres and prisons. And sometimes that's something that we chose to kind of lean on slightly, in that we did that as our first week's action because we thought that people would engage more easily with the narrative around detention centres, which in a way is kind of telling of the type of like people in Cambridgeshire who are engaging in that thread, right? Because in some places the narrative of like migrants coming in and, you know, that whole media storm around that, sometimes that takes more hold. So I think it partly is to do with the people that are trying to engage and how you can communicate with them on those issues. But yeah, we moved quite quickly off the mutual aid thread because, again, as in too many mutual aid groups at the moment, someone said, this is getting very political and mutual aid is not meant to be political. Which we all know is an absolute farce, right? Like, mutual aid is obviously political. And I mean, honestly, if being an abolitionist isn't mutual aid, what is? Because kind of the key form of it, really. But yeah, so that's our Facebook interactions. I mean, I would dearly love to know how we translate abolitionist thoughts and ideas without watering them down, but in a way that is accessible. I think that's something we're all still struggling with, and especially because of the difference in context between the UK and the US, I think. So in the US, I know there's so much more of a kind of culture of prison abolition as a key tenet of the left, what there is of the left in America, whereas in the UK that's kind of less of a like key cornerstone of leftist politics or organising, and that's, I think, an interesting, and definitely has kind of historical reasons for that. I mean, I'm just thinking a lot of the abolition in the UK as well as in the US is through Black feminist movements, and whether currently movements on the left in the UK aren't drawing enough on Black feminist history. Maybe they could do with learning a bit more from it. But it is the sense that just generally in the culture at large, let alone on the left, there's not so much of an understanding of even what abolition is in the UK. Yeah, so that's an interesting difficulty that I know, like when you Google abolition or you Google prison abolition articles, you mainly get things focused on the US. It's not a kind of as much a part of our built-in narrative on the left in the UK. And I think that's something that we should be actively working to change, and groups like Prisoner Solidarity Network are really doing. So yeah.
Yeah, I've still got no one who wants to speak. Everyone's been very shy this evening, but I was wondering if either of the historians had some to contribute on how those kinds of conversations or ideological tensions might have played out in the sort of periods that you've been looking at.
I'm happy to say something, though obviously Ben should say as well if he wants. But thinking about the sympathy thing, one thing that I sort of, appealing to audiences, I suppose the most common, and something that Ben said as well about contagion being conceived of in multiple ways, right? I think that actually the most common discourse that I can see in this period is actually around moral contagion and criminals being in some way contaminated. And that often means that the discussions that might start out with, for example, convicts, in one of my contexts, Cockatoo Island, which is in Sydney, the prisoners kind of can't breathe, so they're grasping through the bars at night to breathe, and that gets reported by a policeman who's stationed on the island for security. And yet the whole thing gets turned around into a question of the convict stain in Australia that they're trying to get rid of, that their international reputation is still for criminals, and that there might be association going on, i.e. sexual relationships between people. And so what became, it's overcrowded, they're in a tiny space, there is no sanitary provision, there's just tubs of excrement about, becomes something that's coded as a different kind of uncleanliness that is more threatening, because it's not just affecting those within, it could affect those without. And words like virus and contamination really get used in these cases of communities being subjected to the virus of these released convicts. And so I was just thinking then again about the question of sympathy, that when we come to the penal reformers that make a difference, they very often take sympathetic individuals and they present their testimonies. And obviously there are moral potential issues with that as a method, especially when you're looking back and you can't talk to those people anymore, and all you've got is a sort of sanitized version of who they are that is most likely to gain sort of sympathy. And we can even see that now with, everybody says, oh, in Australia they only sent thieves transported to Australia for stealing a loaf of bread. Those people were sent, other people were sent too, it's not, but that's not as palatable a narrative for people who want to feel proud of their ancestors or anything like that. And so similarly, when we look at some of the reformers, for example, some of the political prisoners, they're often middle class people, so they write a memoir, but they're absolutely at a remove. So there's one called John Mitchell in Ireland who's a nationalist, and so he feels sorry for the Irish who were sent over in the famine, but not for anybody else. And he basically says, oh, I've heard there's been these terrible outbreaks, but he's kept separate, so he's fine. And then he sort of says, well, I think sanitary reform shouldn't be for people, shouldn't be doing better in prison than when they're outside of prison, and real criminals, they can hang off the rope of ventilation, which is a terrible metaphor he makes about sanitary reform. Anyway, so my very long-winded way of saying that there is an issue with activism that only speaks to sympathetic people, and I think that's why the only example that I could give of very effective penal reform was, interestingly, about Indigenous people, when it tied into a broader kind of feeling at that moment of empire of humanitarianism, but not decolonization, obviously, but a sort of coded kind. Right, so it was a long response.
Cool. Yeah, I have a question from Fee Amos. You're muted at the moment. Yeah, there you go. You seem to be unmuted, but we still can't hear you. There we go.
Better, can you hear me now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. Just to say thanks to all the presenters, really, really brilliant stuff. It was just to draw on what people have started talking about and like what Stella was saying about the differences between like the maybe more like the longer, stronger tradition of prison abolition work in the States compared to maybe in the UK. And I was thinking about the importance of what I understand in the US movement of critiquing the idea that prisons are, the main point of prisons is to run for profit, in the way that narrative kind of fits the UK much better in terms of like movements against highlighting the privatization of prisons and that history, but that obscuring something in the racial politics of why mass incarceration has developed the way it has in the US in terms of like after emancipation, and that being like a schism that's recognized between the two sides of that movement. But with that in mind, I was wondering if either the historians or maybe the activists could talk to a bit more like some pointers of how we could start to pull together like a British, starting in Britain or the British Empire, colonial history of that kind of, that long colonial history of a private prison and those carceral logics, and how we can start to build more of that narrative more concisely around that particular schism. I'll leave it there, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, does anyone want to come in on that?
Well, only just to say that private prisons have been kind of like if I understand the question, a recent reintroduction in the UK. So you know the very first piece of prison reform legislation in 1780 something or other is the abolition of fees for jailers. So prior to that, if you went to prison, you had to pay for your food, you paid for your board, and there was this kind of scandal that basically there were people who'd finished their sentences but were just being kept there because they hadn't been able to pay off the fees to the jailers. And even in even in Georgian England, that was understood to be iniquitous. So you know, I think, and when they first have the plans to build the first penitentiary, so the first modern prison in London, which is the Millbank Penitentiary, that's built where Tate Britain and Chelsea School of Art is today, on that site at Millbank. They make a point. Jeremy Bentham wants to build one and run it for profit. And they understand that, you know, that basically that it's wicked to run prisons for a profit. And after that point, there's no, as I say, there are no private prisons until someone will have to tell me when the Tories reintroduced them. But as I understand it, it's fairly recent, the outsourcing of prison administration in this country to private companies. So you know, there's a long period where there's no such thing as a private prison, as I say, from the 1780s up until, Stella or Dave, help me out, when do we have private prisons reintroduced in this country? So I'll put you on the spot now, haven't I? It's a
I
recent.
don't know when
Is it
exactly.
Is it the 90s?
It could be that I thought even later than that, to be honest. But yeah, it's a recent thing. It's neoliberalism. It's part of outsourcing public services to private contractors. So as I say, there's a long period where there's no private prisons, and as I said, it's kind of understood philosophically, even by the Georgians, who are willing to let most things slide. That it's wicked to run a prison for profit.
Wikipedia says 1992.
Yeah,
I'm not going to argue with Wikipedia.
I chime in there and say that that's only true if you look at the UK. If you look at the Empire, convicts are used for profit. There, the East India Company has its own network of, the trading company has its own network of penal colonies where it sends Indian convicts. So I think, again, that points to that Indian and other kinds of Asian convicts, but primarily Indian convicts, points to that kind of racial divide there, where either for the East India Company or other times for the government, but explicitly to develop colonial resources and territory for trade, that there's a sort of feeling that you can send convicts there in a way that is designed to make profit eventually. And in that sense, that does connect to the kind of US system, because, convicts were sent to the American colonies to compete with indentured labor that was then replaced by plantation slavery. And then when that was abolished, the mass imprisonment is there. So I wonder if that's another reason why that's so ingrained in left-wing culture, is to do with the recognition that there's a very clear racial injustice, really. And I think it's much more muddied, the history here, because we're sending people away as well as keeping them here, and there are different penal ideologies at play, and it's not a clear narrative.
I want to chip in here and work out what the stakes of private prisons are for an abolitionist perspective. So that what Ben just said about Georgians opposing to them as specifically wicked, somehow perhaps more wicked than other prisons. And I think that is definitely an idea that endures at the moment. I think that, if you say the government is building a new prison, people say, oh, that's probably bad. And if you say the government's building a private prison that's going to be run by Serco or something, people say, oh my God, that's terrible. And I think there's a lot of different sort of biases wrapped up in that. So one of them is, I genuinely think an enthusiasm for the public sector means people are more forgiving of publicly run prisons, which I think is a problem. I think that there is a kind of weird liberal opposition to profit in some areas, but not, so people are broadly happy to live in a world governed by profit, but maybe profit shouldn't be found in certain areas like prisons, because that seems to violate the belief that prisons are there to serve a moral end, like as a punishment or rehabilitation or whatever. So if you introduce profit into that makes it specifically bad in a way it wasn't before. I think there are specific reasons why we should, there are reasons that private prisons are bad in ways that other prisons aren't, that I'm not going to pretend don't exist, or, we don't need to be completely blanket with this, but it's worth teasing out what those objections are and what traditions of thought they belong to.
You had Millie waiting to come in.
Hi, have I managed to unmute? Right, good. Right, cool. To build on Dave's point, I like one thing I know that is often a fear around the idea of private prisons is that, which is a fear that has some reality, I think, but the idea that maybe in some way more people will be sentenced, or maybe people will be kept in prison because there will be this incentive to keep people in prison because there's money to be made out of them, and which is not entirely, I think, wrong. Maybe there is like a bit of a naive belief that the state wouldn't ever have any interest in innocent people being in prison, sort of thing, as if, the problem with it is the idea that oh, if it was a publicly run prison, then nobody clearly would do that, which is, yeah, I think is a naive belief. I mean, the thing about private prisons and work, even when prisons in the UK were not private prisons, there was the thing still of profitable work being done by prisoners. Like that was always a constant thing, that prisoners would work, and that would be work that was sort of that made a profit. And actually, one thing in the whole prison riot of '76, I think, one of the things they objected to was bad conditions in the workshops, dust and bad conditions. But one of the other things they objected to was that they were making things for the Shah of Iran, and some people objected that they didn't want to do that. I don't know how widespread that objection was. Possibly it was quite a sort of specific objection by a few people, but I don't know. I always just thought that was interesting. So yeah, when prisons in the UK weren't private, there would still be a profit-making element operating within the prison. Does that make sense? Cool.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Did any of the panel want to come back on that before I bring in someone else? Yeah, Ben.
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify that absolutely, I wasn't suggesting that there wasn't work done in prisons that weren't run privately. The objection was to the prison, it's the existence of the prison itself profiting a private company or a private individual. But there were attempts. It was actually, though, quite difficult. I mean, again, I don't know about the kind of post 1945. It's beyond anything that I've looked at in detail. But you know, in the between the mid 19th and mid 20th century, it was always difficult trying to find work for prisoners that was profitable. There were competing things about prison work. So prison work was supposed to be reforming. You know, there's the idea that hard work is going to reform you from being a criminal. And it's going to teach you a useful trade that you'll be able to do when you leave prison, so you won't be a criminal when you leave prison. But at the same time, it's supposed to be unpleasant as well. It's supposed to be a punishment. It's not supposed to be enjoyable work. And at the same time, originally, if you go back to the kind of Victorian prisons, yes, there was the idea that the prison's supposed to pay for itself as well. So the idea is that the prisoners will do work and that the prisons aren't going to be a burden on the taxpayer, and try to find work that did all of these things at the same time. And then it was also difficult, you know, once you get kind of stronger trade unions objected to prisoners doing work that they believed, you know, trade organisations and trade unions thought that you know, if work was being stolen from them, or if prisons were undercutting working men and tradesmen, there were objections to that as well. So there was sort of, you know, there's always sort of big problems around prison labour.
Can I pick up on that very quickly before we move on?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I feel, as a representative of an organisation that used to be called the Incarcerated Workers Organising Committee, I should talk about prison labour. So we've got this recruitment crisis in the agricultural industry in the UK at the moment as a result of coronavirus and Brexit. And the National Farmers Union, which is the employers' organisation for agricultural employers, the solution that they have arrived at is that we should just get prisoners to do it. And it's a really common solution for people to arrive at when they're worried about a labour shortage, because prisoners, the prison population, exists in the imagination of a lot of people as this available pool of workers, which is kind of why that union response you just Ben just referred to is important. And what I find particularly interesting about that is that what those people are doing when they express this suggestion or this anxiety is acknowledging the existence of what Marx called a reserve army of labour, which is a way of disciplining people who are in work, which they probably wouldn't acknowledge the existence of or put in those terms under other circumstances, but they nonetheless kind of enact that view when they start talking about prisoners as just this handy pool of available workers who are just there whenever you need them, whenever you have decided that paying the minimum wage is not compatible with your bottom line. The people who are available to you are prisoners. That's kind of a real common response.
And Becca Hudson was going to come in. Becca.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much to everybody that spoke. It was really really great. I just wanted to, just on the question of kind of private prisons and prison labour, just to mention that I think there is a conception that in America the whole prison system is privately run and that here it's majority publicly run. But that's not actually the case, in terms of there is actually a higher proportion of prisons in the UK that are privately owned than there are in America. And so some of those, I guess, like received ideas of the different functions that those different systems fulfill is not always matching up to reality. And I think also on the labour question, I'd really encourage people here to read the work of Ruth Wilson Gilmore. There's a really accessible, like, quick interview with her on the Verso Books blog. And there she explains that, once again, when we think often about the labour that prisoners do, we think of it in those terms of like private profit making, but actually anybody that's been in a prison anywhere in this or many other countries will know the vast majority of work that you do in jail is the work to maintain the jail. You feed people, you cook, you feed people, you clean, you maintain the visitors hall. This is the labour that takes up the vast majority of prisoners' days. And so I think that it's important for us to think about what work, why there is so much work going into the maintenance of the institution itself. Prisons do not look like sweatshops, mostly. They look like a huge number of people maintaining the institution for free or for extremely small amounts of money, which go down the worse, the more badly behaved you are. And yeah, I think it's interesting to look at, you know, what a prisoner's day looks like and what that tells us about the work that's going on inside prisons and how that connects to society. But yeah, thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Yeah, does anyone on the panel want to come back on that point? I've got no one waiting in the chat, so if you do want to speak, please put your name in the chat in a private message to me. But if anyone on the panel wants to come back on that last point about work in prisons. Maybe not. So
just to say that I think that's a really important point, and I'm really glad that Becca made it.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, one of the things that I was thinking of, going back to our mutual aid chat, and actually mutual aid was the first topic we did for these sort of lockdown workshops. And one of the issues that came up there, not related to prisons, but about how a lot of the sort of response of people in mutual aid groups who, you know, aren't necessarily of the left has been one of wanting to police the lockdown and to sort of criminalize different groups. And I was wondering if anyone, I don't know, the sort of interaction between that and how we talk about prisons in lockdown and what kinds of issues or problems that's raising for you guys in organising at the moment.
There is like a slight, a kind of, and it's definitely, it's a kind of ideology that's constructed quite consciously by the government and by those in power, but of the kind of like blitz spirit, you know, this weird like neighborhood watch. So like down my street, I live in quite a like residential area, and there are two lampposts, and both of them had a neighborhood watch sign on them, and between them someone had hung a Union Jack. And I was like, wow, this really is summing up quite a lot of things right now. But I think it's not necessarily linked in as much of a practical way, like as in most of the people that the police are approaching because they're breaking lockdown are being fined, which is still bad, and it's the police are still being very heavy-handed with that, and it's still certain groups, as always, that are being attacked by the police in this way. But it's on the like ideological level at which the system which people are encouraged to snitch on their neighbor or to phone the police on someone is the system which enables this carceral logic where there are good people and there are bad people, and the good people remain safe as long as the bad people are put in prison. And as long as they're dealt with and put outside over there, then that's fine. And I think what this kind of times of pandemic or crisis in a like health capacity really show is that what prisons claim to do, which is to kind of vanish the evils and ill of society, they are incapable of, we all know this, they're incapable of doing that, and actually what it does is vanishes people from society. It takes away, there's that really, is it Angela Davis, the quote that prisons don't get rid of bad things, they like vanish people. Anyway, I'm butchering it, but the point being that we've seen in the recent weeks that the way people conceptualize punishment and what is a crime, it is so malleable and so dependent on the systems which operate within our society, that there's no way that you can vanish all of these problems that we've seen, right? Like all of the things that we've seen in this crisis have been issues for a long time. They're not, it's shown the level of poverty in this country. It's shown the level of the disproportionate the problems faced by working class communities more so than others, or BME communities more so than others. That it's just brought those to the light, and I think it does the same with the problem of prisons, and that mindset, it kind of flags it up for what it really is to some people, but it also means that it's easy for people to disengage. I think there's that point at which people are kind of like, why are you talking about this now? Which is definitely a discussion that's been had in the mutual aid groups when we've shared our stuff on this. They've been kind of saying, we're all dealing with problems. Why are you asking us to care about this right now? And I think that's something that we need to really fight back against where we can, because that's the individualizing aspect of neoliberalism, right? It's like, you, as long as you're all right in your own little section of society, it's all fine. But we all know that that's absolutely inadequate, and needs to be countered where it can be.
Yes, I've still got no one waiting to speak. So I mean, another issue I wanted to raise relatedly. I mean, I work on the history of mental health personally, and you know, Ben mentioned the massive increase in prison population from the 1950s at exactly the sort of same time that the asylum population is decreasing, and the sort of deinstitutionalization of mental health is an interesting model of a sort of form of decarceration, which then creates its own problems, and obviously a lot of the people end up within the prison system anyway. But I was wondering if Dave or Stella had any comments to make on what's happening at the moment in high security mental hospitals, and how the health crisis of coronavirus is playing out in terms of mental health as well.
I don't think I have. I'm trying to think if I've got any specific knowledge about that I can share, other than to. So I don't think I know anything about high security mental hospitals. I don't think. And in terms of the general prison population, other than to say that exactly what you expect would be happening is happening, which is that everyone's mental health is getting worse and worse because they are forced into 23-hour lockdown and have no access to communications with people on the outside. Like, I'm trying to think if there's more that I can add to that would be insightful, but maybe the obvious thing is the most important thing there.
So does anyone else want to come in and speak at this point? Or do maybe Ben and Katherine want to respond from the historian's point of view to the points that have been raised by Stella and Dave?
Ben, go first.
One of you has to go first.
Yeah, no, I will do. I mean, there's not a great deal more to say other than what I've said already. But I mean, only I think to again go back to two things really. One, I think that it's worth making that point again, that, you know, from the government's point of view, you know, and it's a bit like the NHS. You know, the NHS wasn't overwhelmed. As far as the government looks at it, they see that they've succeeded because the NHS wasn't overwhelmed. And as we know, that the NHS hasn't been overwhelmed because they basically, you know, outsourced the death count to the care homes, you know, and to hedge their bets, you know, transferred the Excel Centre and various other sort of large venues into military field hospitals, which basically just intended to kind of function as death barns if you know, the much higher or much steeper mortality rate that they feared might happen materialised in sort of late March, early April. So, you know, the government sort of in this thing that they kind of feel like, oh, well, we got away with it. And I think they've got a similar attitude, really, to the prisons. On the one hand, you know, I mean, it would be the same if it was a Labour government as well, because the Labour governments are equally authoritarian when it comes to criminal justice. But certainly, you know, if the idea that Priti Patel was going to, you know, release 4,000, well, she's Home Secretary now, so it's Minister of Justice. I can't remember for the moment who the Minister of Justice is, but for that person to, you know, release, they were saying 4,000. You know, in France, they ended up releasing 10,000 prisoners. In the UK, with something that, you know, a UK minister would avoid at all costs, not least because, you know, the Daily Mail and the rest of the newspapers would then be monitoring every single one of those individuals, and, you know, if there was, you know, any one of them then was involved in further offending, that would be all over the front pages. So that's the kind of environment that they're operating in. So as I say, they want to avoid at all costs the mass release. But the risk, as I say, was of, you know, stratospheric mortality rates in prisons. They were anticipating 3,500, and accompanying that, you know, widespread disorder. This was the other thing they feared, because this is what happened in Italy in March, that, you know, that people start rioting in the prisons and riots spread throughout the prison. So they were kind of faced, you know, there are two, you know, the two very unwelcome outcomes, and they kind of feel that they've got away with this by putting everyone on, as we were saying, you know, basically banging everyone up permanently in their cells, banning all visits, you know, clamping down on mail, and, you know, everything else that they can do. And as we know, you know, they're completely reactive. You know, their whole response to the public health emergency has been reactive. They don't really have a plan. You know, they're doing everything on the back foot. And evidently, the idea is that, okay, we're now just going to sit on this for a year, and you know, it will involve you know, much more draconian discipline in prisons, I should imagine, because, you know, they've reckoned, I'm sorry, a powder keg is a terrible cliche, so forgive me that, but, you know, they recognise that, you know, they're sitting on top of a potentially explosive situation. And, you know, they're just hoping if they can sit on that for a year, it will stay out of the papers. And this is the point, you know, that you're talking about, Stella. It won't be part of people's awareness. You know, people have, and as I say, it's a pity, because it's losing, it's a lost moment of opportunity, because, you know, we've seen what's happened with public awareness, for instance, with people who work in care homes. You know, we've known that people who work in care homes are, you know, exploited, hideously underpaid. You know, people on 0 hours contracts who, you know, don't get paid for the journey in between visiting, you know, different clients. This sort of shit that's been going on for years, and no one gives a damn about it. You know, suddenly everyone's become very, very aware of it. You know, everyone's aware about delivery drivers on 0 hours contracts, and how much, you know, student nurses having to pay for paid bursaries and all this stuff that's you know, people generally are happy to ignore when we've got Brexit and Harry and Meghan and all the rest of the shit going on every day, suddenly is in people's faces and people are talking about it. So I'm sure the government, you know, is very, very keen if we can keep, you know, a crisis in the prisons, you know, either a mortality, you know, coronavirus crisis and or prison riots off the front page and just trundle along for a year. You know, we'll at least have got away with that one, which seems to be, you know, their attitude to all of this. So apologies, Stephen, I told you I might end up just ranting about the government, but there you go. You did ask me to respond.
There's definitely a place for that, Ben. I had a guy to come in.
Yeah, hi. Last event we were talking a bit about the stats and what and how activists should be using the stats that are coming out. And so I was just Googling the stats on the number of prisoners who've been released, which is apparently about 3,000 so far, which is well, that's what the minister was saying yesterday. That seems to me quite a useful stat for campaigners and one to hang on to. And it seems to me we should be trying to grasp the kind of the data that can support our cases right now. But so one question I've got really is kind of like what kinds of information will be useful for going forward from the current situation. And then the other one is connected with, you know, the sort of the phases that people see in pandemics, and obviously the government is going to present the prison, the relative lack of cases in prison as a huge success compared to other areas of public policy. And on a certain level, it is. I mean, you know, it's certainly better than there being, you know, hundreds of people dying in prison, which could have happened. So you know, we do have to recognise that whilst looking at ways of fighting the general structure. But you know, most another aspect of pandemics is that there is a huge decline in crime in the early phases of a pandemic. Most studies show that changes dramatically in the later phases, particularly as lockdowns, you know, are released, are kind of pulled back from, and so we can expect a much more punitive culture probably to emerge as also we start to see things like mass unemployment, which we haven't really seen on the kind of scale we're about to get for nearly 40 years, you know, and so I just wonder whether these kind of structural things that are kind of on the horizon are both affecting how you're planning to campaign, and also whether the historians have anything to say about sort of wider economic and sort of structural changes and how that affects people, you know, responses to penal policy. So that's a very long-winded question.
Can I just, and I don't have an answer for that question, or those questions, Guy, but I just quickly want to check your figure about the 3,000, because that must have been very, very recent, because I'd seen, I mean, it was just over a week ago that they were still reporting that only 33 of the actual 4,000 have been released, which means that sometime over the past 10 days, there's been a kind of turnaround on that. And they have actually, they were promising to release 4,000 at the beginning of April. So they've now literally, I don't know or if Dave or Stella are aware of that. I wasn't aware that they've actually now done a mass release, but you're suggesting that they have, Guy?
This was a press release from Lucy Fraser on the 28th of April. So,
oh, right, okay.
I don't know whether I don't know anything about these figures, but that's...
Yeah, I've got The Guardian on the 28th of April saying only 33 have actually been released.
Yeah, well, I don't know.
I don't know.
Different data, but have a look. I put the link in the chat anyway.
Did anyone want to come in on Guy's point about the sort of long-term structural effects of the pandemic and how that's going to affect the situation in prisons, and also, you know, how we organise against them? Go on, Stella, yeah.
I think it's I think it's why we've what we've all been kind of saying about how we can't allow our abolitionist movements to be dictated by the narrative of a crisis, because this is going to be continuing for a long time and the effects of this are going to be felt for a long time. So I think that's why it's even more important to have a response that's not just we have to keep people in prison safe from coronavirus by keeping them isolated, etc., because that doesn't deal with the issues of you know, massively increased poverty, like the increased police powers that we've seen, things on those lines that are going to that do interact with the abolitionist projects, not to mention the conditions of people in prison. Like if the plan is to kind of stick it out and keep people in these you know, solitary confinements and prefab cells for the next 2 years, is that, you know, is that sustainable? I mean, that's a kind of horrific prospect for most people in prison, and something that we definitely need to be organising against.
Yeah, I got one more question from Millie, which I'll take, and maybe we've got 10 minutes left, so if anyone wants to get in a final question, now's the time. So I'll take Millie's question, and then maybe after that, if there's no more questions, go to the panel for sort of final thoughts to wrap up the session. So Millie.
I hope that this is on topic. One thing that, as like an observation over time, I think that there has been a change very much for the worse in 2 ways. I'm talking a long time span. What am I talking? Talking from the mid-80s to now, maybe? One thing is a sort of creep of like there were these attempts, I don't know how many of them came into being, but there were attempts of things like, oh, if you get arrested for something, we can stop you from getting housing benefit, or, oh, we can evict you from your flat if you are convicted of XYZ, you know, the idea of like a sort of a creep, like a stretching of like what the criminal justice system could, like rather than having a thing of if you get caught doing X, if we catch you, we can nick you, then we can fine you, and possibly we can jail you. Then when your sentence is over, then it's over, and then you released, and these are the options, sort of thing. And now this thing of much more like, oh yeah, you can be barred from receiving this service or this benefit. I don't know how much of that actually happened, but it was stuff that like the Tony Blair Labour government used to announce it, like constantly were announcing things like that, I think possibly without actually doing them. But you know, the whole sort of ASBO culture and everything. So ASBO's making things, giving things criminal sanctions when you hadn't necessarily been as such convicted of a crime. So I think, I don't know the right words for this, I'm sure that there is like very good language to describe these things, which I don't have, I'm sorry. But this stretching, am I making sense? Are you following me? Yeah, good, right. Good, and that's one of them. And then the other thing that I think has got a lot worse over this same time period, so from the mid-80s to now, I'm taking the mid-80s as this is when I started to like be able to be aware of things, not because it's some important time bracket. It's just from my teenage years, I suppose. The other thing that I think has got a lot worse from then to now is people being in the criminal justice system as defendants and getting convicted and serving sentences having a much more of a long-term effect on what you're not allowed to do afterwards. Like the whole thing with police checks affecting your employment much more now than they used to. Like police checks for things that are not relevant, you know, not in terms of things that are actual safety issues, but just generically having any kind of a criminal record being much more of a bar to employment. And a lot of other things where people are, it used to be much more normal that lots of people had a bit of a criminal record and it wasn't that much of a big deal, and it has become, I think, much more of a block on you being able to do things. And I think if we're going into a very harsh time, I think these two factors, I think they matter quite a lot. Also, I don't see people talking about them very much, and I don't really know why, unless I just look in the wrong place. But I don't see it being discussed in that way very much. I don't know.
Well, thanks, Millie. I think because we've got 5 minutes left, I'll take the final comment and then I'll go to the panel to sort of wrap up and answer Millie's questions in that as well. So finally, Pete. You're still muted, Pete.
Hello there, can you hear me now? Cool. Sorry for coming in late and using this to plug my project, but I work for a oral history project at the University of Manchester called HA21, and we've been working inside a prison over the past year. Obviously that's come to an end now, but I have a free hand in what I can pursue as a coordinator to actually get interviews regarding. And I really, at the moment, because we're hopefully being extended because of COVID-19 for another 18 months, if we're lucky, I really want to get more voices and interviews from within and around the prison system. Not only because obviously what we're here to discuss is going on, but I mean, before COVID, we were interviewing prisoners specifically about their experiences of healthcare. And it was a really vital, really interesting way into thinking, into approaching, you know, carcerality and thinking about, you know, how health and prison are kind of imbricated, how it's part of the punishment in a lot of ways. We were working with, you know, we were in HMP Leyhill in Gloucestershire, which is a Cat D prison, but with a pretty aged population with a lot of very complex health needs. They've got a palliative care corridor, which is fun, and working with disabled and terminally ill prisoners there, getting their accounts of basically exploring their lives inside through, and their lives outside, through the prison of health was really useful, I thought, and I think that's only going to get a lot more urgent and a lot more pronounced now after COVID. So I kind of just wanted to big up my project and say that if anyone, we would love to talk to activists, former prisoners, probation officers, prison doctors, basically anyone who works in or around or indeed against the system, who can give us a personal perspective on health in prisons. So please forward them along to me.
That's great. If you've got a link to something that you can drop in the chat, that'd be great, and we can tweet that and put that on the website as well. So yeah, if I can finally, for the last few minutes, very briefly, I guess, go back to the panel for sort of responses to Millie's questions, which are about the sort of creep of the criminal justice system, I suppose, into social life more broadly, and then also into prisoners' lives once they're not in prison anymore, and also just any final thoughts on the discussion or any sort of calls for things that we want to come out of this. So we normally do this in reverse order. So I'll go Ben, Katherine, then Stella, then Dave. And yeah, if we can keep it to just a couple of minutes each, that'd be great. Ben.
Yeah, no, I mean, having had my sort of huge rant on the last go, I'll try and keep this as brief as possible. But just, yeah, I think what Millie says, you know, I absolutely recognise, and it's, you know, the sort of criminal justice policy and technology just kind of has its own internal logic. So, you know, we saw this with anti-terror legislation. You know, they bring in legislation ostensibly to deal with terrorism, and then that's then used you know, monitor, to control and suppress trade unionists and environmental activists, for instance. So, you know, these things just have this thing of kind of joining up together. So I think you're absolutely right. And, you know, looking at the post-virus world, you know, increased data surveillance is undoubtedly going to be part of that world. I think that's inevitable. So, you know, we're going to have, you know, austerity-driven, debt-laden nation states, and, you know, impoverished working classes. I mean, this is just in this country, this is around the world. And as I say, increased data surveillance. You know, and so that's all adding up to a pretty bleak picture. And I think, you know, we'd all be wise to recognise that that's one direction in which this is headed. But at the same time, as I say, you know, we also need to recognise that it's a moment of opportunity. I think there's a sort of broad understanding of that, you know, this really is a moment where things might change. And I think, yeah, as I've tried to argue here, in terms of decarceration, as much as anything else, this, you know, is potentially a moment that could be seized.
Cheers, man. Katherine.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate how much I've got out of this event and how productive I think these kinds of discussions can hopefully be. I think from the little I know about the more recent period, that what Millie says absolutely chimes with what I've noticed in the news, and that this kind of slow creep, this exceptionalism, absolutely has always historically been a way to reduce liberties, to do things sort of under emergency powers that then become the new normal. And obviously one of the things that's worrying currently is the you know, courts going increasingly online, reducing the bench of magistrates to one magistrate, etc., things that we've heard about. And I just wanted to quickly go back to what Guy said, which is just to say that I think we certainly need to be looking with concern to the post-pandemic, or however long it continues, period, because, you know, periods of mass unemployment are times historically where in the convict transportation area, for example, Napoleonic War, really low crime levels, because you've sent all your young men off to war. When they come back and there's mass unemployment, that's when we really see emergency powers kick in, the creation of hulks, which keep people unhealthy for the next 80 years, and we see loads of people banished basically across the world against their will. So I think while there may be different methods now, we'll certainly see a state response that is carceral, I suspect. And yeah, just to say, I've dropped my details in the chat, so if anybody wants to contact me, I'd be very keen to continue discussions. Thank you.
Cool. I think you accidentally sent them just to me, Katherine, so if you want to jot them to everyone, that'd be great. So yeah, we'll go to Stella.
Yeah, just echoing what Katherine was just saying, it's been a really useful and interesting discussion. And I think I just want to, yeah, again, thank Millie for bringing that up. You've absolutely hit the nail on the head with those points. And I think that's something where young people who are just getting involved in activism now, it's quite key to pass on that kind of knowledge to people and to do this kind of discussion yeah, passing on the historical memory of movements, as well as learning from the past, just the kind of facts of what's been going on over the past sort of 20 or 30 years, and further back than that, as we've seen today. But yeah, I think it's worth thinking about how we can use the structures that have been popping up because of coronavirus. So the mutual aid groups, the fact that people now are more likely to know who's on their street, just those kinds of things. And those of us who have been organising for a while or are involved in organising, thinking about how that can allow us to reach out to different networks or to engage people in different ways. And that's something that definitely I haven't worked out how the best way to do is yet, but I definitely think there is a way to engage people at this kind of moment, but then to carry it on. And that's the key thing, right? To build awareness of abolition and a movement around prison abolition in the UK that can really have force and backing. So I think it's small steps, right? But there's definitely there are definitely ways we can do this. And I think the other thing that I just wanted to mention is something Dave brought up right at the very start, which is that it's so much more difficult to communicate with people in prisons now. And I think what we really have to not allow ourselves to do is to become that what you were saying at the start, Dave, is like gifting support to these poor prisoners, this weird paternalistic thing that we really don't want to do. And so thinking really creatively about how we can fully engage people in prisons in our activism now, and making sure that they feel part of and are able to contribute to our groups.
Great, thanks, Stella. And finally to Dave.
Great. Yeah, so thank you. This has been a great thing to be part of. So just coming back on Millie's points about prison system and punishment stretching into life. One thing that's really important to us is that we don't people continue to be members of the Prisoner Solidarity Network after they are released from prison, and a big chunk of what we're doing is helping people acclimatise to life, helping people find work, or whatever other kinds of solidarity we can offer, right? That's really important to us, and that's an ongoing thing. And the other thing that Millie's point reminded me of was the 2011 riots, in which a lot of people who had been convicted of riot offences, their whole families lost housing benefit. I mean, there were some really stark punitive things being done through the benefit system. And I guess maybe responding to some of the forecast Guy was making, I imagine we will see some riots on the streets in the not too distant future, but we will definitely be seeing riots inside prisons in the not too distant future. And I think in PSN, we are kind of aware that things are going to be getting worse, and we are going to have to just work that much harder to kind of maintain the work that we're doing and the whatever kinds of mutual aid and solidarity that we're able to provide. And so part of that, and this is as much a personal thing for me as for the organisation, is really grappling with those contradictions that this kind of organising demands of us. So obviously, our ultimate aim is not for prisons to be livable experiences, right? We do not want a sustainable prison system. We do not want a prison system at all. And yet the work that we're doing requires of us that we try and kind of enable people to cope with that situation as best as is possible. So on the one hand, I think we all need to be more stubborn and more kind of forthright and scrupulous and insistent with abolitionist politics, and to not make those compromises with discourses of innocence or reform discursively at the very least, but also practically we very much have to do whatever is possible to improve things. So I'm afraid I'm going to end in a really boring way by just reiterating the fundraiser, which I've just put back in the chat, to say if anyone is, I know, you know, things are getting tighter for everyone, but if people can donate a bit, certainly if people can share it, we'd really appreciate it, because although this now, in the context of this big conversation about abolition, seems like a very small thing, enabling people to phone their loved ones and buy soap is really important. So thank you.
Thanks, Dave. That's really important. Yeah, and we will definitely share that link and put it on the website. And also, it's great to see so many people putting contact details and sort of being open to networking in the future in the chat, and we'll make sure to keep all of that as well. I can thank all our panel. It's been a really interesting, really useful discussion, and thanks for everyone who participated. I'm just, before we go, I'm going to flag our next workshop, which we have lined up already, which we don't usually, but it's on the 9th of June, so in 3 weeks' time. The link is there. It's on recording the crisis, so we're looking at archiving some of the efforts that have already been happening and how we archive in a crisis. We've got Paul Dudman from the Living Refugee Archive. Hopefully we'll have one more activist archivist, and we've got Charlotte Clements and Andrew Flynn as our historians for that. So yeah, do keep, the registration is open for that now, so please do register and keep an eye on Twitter for future events. Thanks so much to everyone. Bye.